I will now call the hearing to order. Good morning. The committee meets today to examine the security situation in South and Central Asia in light of the transition of U.S. military forces from Afghanistan. This is the sixth event in a series of committee engagements that seek to assess the United States military's 20-year mission in Afghanistan, understand factors that led to the Taliban's rapid takeover of the country and the collapse of the Afghan forces, oversee DoD operations in support of Afghan evacuees, and recalibrate ongoing counterterrorism operations in light of emerging threats and broader national security priorities. Joining us today are Dr. Colin Cowell, Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, and Lieutenant General James Mingus, Director for Operations J3 Joint Staff. I thank you both for being here. I know there may be a tendency during this hearing to focus on our final months in Afghanistan. I would stress again that our withdrawal this summer and the events surrounding it did not happen in a vacuum. The path that led to this outcome was paved with years of mistakes, from our catastrophic pivot to Iraq to our failure to effectively grapple with Pakistan's support for the Taliban to the flawed Doha Agreement. This is not a Democratic or Republican problem. These failures have manifested over 4 presidential administrations of both parties, and a willingness to recognize and correct past mistakes will impact the operation of today and the future. One fundamental question that requires close examination is, how did the decade-long strategy for building the Afghan national defense and security forces result in a force that was incapable of defeating the Taliban and seemingly collapsed in a matter of days? We need to better understand what led to the development of Afghan security forces that suffered from low morale, widespread corruption, and which were incapable of operating without U.S. and coalition support. In addition, we need to assess the extent to which the failure of the Afghan government to earn the loyalty of the Afghan security forces contributed to their being unwilling to defend the Kabul government against the Taliban. Further, our inability across multiple administrations to effectively deal with Pakistan is another example of past being prologue. Managing the security relationship with Pakistan will remain important as we seek to successfully implement a regional counterterrorism strategy with other partners and allies. That is why it is vitally important for us to reflect upon and study the entirety of the 20-year mission in Afghanistan. I agreed with Secretary Austin and General Milley's testimony to this committee last month that there should be a comprehensive review spanning the war in Afghanistan. I would support a formal independent study of the Afghan war, as Senator Duckworth and a number of our colleagues have taken the lead in preparing. I look forward to working towards authorizing such a review as part of the National Defense Authorization Act. At the same time, we cannot allow our examination of the past mission to come at the expense of our national security for today and the future. While the United States has ended its military mission in Afghanistan, we must continue to ensure that al-Qaeda, ISIS-K, and other terrorist groups cannot use Afghanistan to attack the United States and our allies. We must remain vigilant about these threats and ensure that we establish an effective and robust counterterrorism architecture moving forward. Last week, the members of this committee received a classified update on regional security issues and threats. The American people deserve to be reassured that the Department remains actively engaged in defending the homeland against terrorist threats emanating from this region. Under Secretary Call and General Mingus, I would ask that, to the extent you can, because of the sensitive nature of this material, during today's open session, provide an update on efforts to address the threat from terrorist groups operating in Afghanistan and across South and Central Asia. I would also appreciate an update on progress toward building a new regional counterterrorism architecture. Finally, I would like to understand the status of negotiations with regional allies and partners to facilitate this new posture, whether and how our adversaries may attempt to constrain or stymie such efforts and strategies for mitigation. Before I turn to Ranking Member Inner for his opening remarks, I'd like to remind my colleagues that there will be a classified session immediately following this open session in SV 217, the Office of Senate Security, and also remind my colleagues that there are scheduled 3 votes this morning, so this will be somewhat complicated. With that, let me recognize the Ranking Member, Senator Inhofe. Senator.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for our witnesses for appearing here today. Welcome back, Secretary Call. As the most senior policy advisors at DOD, it's appropriate that you agreed to testify in open session on these critical issues. Let's be clear why we're here today. As a result of the chaotic withdrawal of the U.S. troops in Afghanistan, 13 servicemen and women were killed. At least hundreds of American citizens were left behind, and many thousands of Afghan partners have been abandoned. Although some of our questions on this drawdown have been answered, we still have a long way to go until all of our questions are answered. And I want to thank Chairman Reed for working with us on continuing this oversight process. Now, too often, the current administration tells us that President Biden was forced to withdraw from Afghanistan because of President Trump's agreement with the Taliban. And that's just not true, and I think everyone knows that's not true. First, President Biden hasn't felt bound by President Trump's policies on anything else, on Iran or on the southwest border or on funding our military. Second, the Doha Agreement was a condition-based approach. Under President Trump's plan, and the U.S. agreed to withdraw troops only if the Taliban met 7 conditions. These conditions included preventing the al-Qaeda from threatening the United States from Afghanistan and denying residence to those threatening the United States. These conditions weren't met. In fact, as General Milley told us, only one of the 7 conditions was met. As we've heard in recent hearings, al-Qaeda remains active in Afghanistan and will likely threaten the United States homeland very, very soon. And that's why all of President Biden's military advisors told him to keep at least 2,500 troops to continue fighting the terrorists, to protect Americans here and in the homeland. But President Biden withdrew anyway. He did not feel bound by President Trump's conditions-based approach and did not follow it. I wish he had. We would all be safer today if that were the case. Now, Secretary Call, you were confirmed on April the 27th, so you did not make a recommendation on President Biden's decision to pull all of the troops from Afghanistan by a set date, rather than based on the conditions on the ground. But you were the most senior policy advisors at DOD for the next 4 months as this tragedy played out, from May through the end of August. What I want to know, and what the American people want to know, and what our troops who served and sacrificed in Afghanistan absolutely deserve to know, is what did President Biden most senior advisors do during those 4 months. We want to understand what this national security team did on a day-to-day basis as a warning light after warning light began to blink red. We need to understand and then fix what went wrong so that we can keep American families safe and protect our interests in the future. The consequences of the president's disastrous decision are impossible to ignore. An Afghan interpreter for our Australian allies was executed last week. China is going after rare earth metals there. Girls are being prevented from going to school. That's just the beginning. The danger is likely to grow across the world and in our own backyard. We have heard from our military officials and our intelligence officials how little we really know about the rising threat of terrorism now that Afghanistan is a safe haven for these organizations. But instead of an honest look at what went wrong, the Biden administration has hunkered down and said this withdrawal was an extraordinary success. And instead of putting together a real counterterrorism plan for the future, all we get is buzzwords. So I look forward to our witnesses' testimony, and thank you, Chairman Reed.
Thank you very much, Senator Inhofe. Dr. Collins and Mr. Secretary, please begin.
Chairman Reed, Ranking Member Inhofe, and distinguished members of the Senate Armed Services Committee, thank you for the opportunity to join you today to discuss the military withdrawal from Afghanistan and the Department's role in Operation Allies Welcome. Today, I am joined by Lieutenant General Jim Mingus, Director J3 Joint Staff, who will also provide opening remarks following mine. Let me start by echoing Secretary Austin and expressing my pride in our service members. Over the last 20 years in Afghanistan, our men and women in uniform have performed countless acts of bravery. 2,461 of them paid the ultimate sacrifice while doing so. I know members of this committee share my gratitude to our troops who have faithfully served and sacrificed, spent months and years away from family and loved ones, and endured repeated combat tours, all to protect the homeland. For 2 decades, our men and women serving in Afghanistan acted with courage and compassion. Yet the performance of our soldiers, airmen, sailors, and Marines during the historic evacuation was unparalleled. In the 48-hour span following the Taliban takeover of Kabul, our troops on the ground secured an airport in contested territory. In just 17 days, they evacuated the largest airlift of people in history, unprecedented both in scope and scale, enabling the evacuation of more than 120,000 U.S. citizens, lawful permanent residents, third country nationals, Afghan partners, including those eligible for special immigrant visas, and the State Department's locally employed staff, and other vulnerable Afghans at risk. As I testified previously, no other military on earth could have accomplished that feat, and we as Americans should be immensely proud. The success of the U.S. evacuation operation was enabled by our military planners and their diligent development of contingency plans. Immediately following the President's April announcement of our military withdrawal from Afghanistan, the Department of Defense went to work ensuring that the drawdown could be accomplished responsibly. Though we did not imagine a situation in which the Afghan government and security forces would collapse in a matter of days prior to the conclusion of our retrograde, the Department began iterating on evacuation scenarios, including the possibility of a contested evacuation in the spring of 2021. Not only did we plan, we proactively took steps in case of emergency. In June, the Secretary pre-positioned forces in the region and sent the Ronald Reagan Carrier Strike Group to the Gulf to cover the withdrawal. In August, as conditions worsened, additional forces were placed on alert. Forethought as much as skill and bravery allowed our service members to execute this extraordinary mission. To be sure, there were complications and tragedy. While airlifting up to 9,000 people per day from Kabul, we experienced overcrowding at the airport and at our interim staging bases for evacuees on their way to the United States. In a highly dynamic environment, we constantly had to adapt to access and evacuate U.S. citizens, lawful permanent residents, and Afghan evacuees. And in the end, we were unable to reach some of those we sought to evacuate by August 31st. There were also heartbreaking costs. In the final days of the withdrawal, we lost 13 American service members to a horrific ISIS-K suicide attack on the airport. These 13 heroes sacrificed their lives to save tens of thousands of innocent people. We will forever mourn the tragedy of their deaths and honor the humanity that they demonstrated in their final mission. I'm also acutely aware of the costs borne by Afghans. Last week, I met with the President of Nutrition and Education International, NEI, Dr. Stephen Kwan. He told me of the extraordinary life lived by Mr. Zamarai Ahmadi, an aid worker employed by NEI and one of the 10 civilians mistakenly killed during the August 29th U.S. airstrike in Kabul. It was clear from our conversation that among the 10 innocent lives lost, including children, Afghanistan lost a tremendous humanitarian in this erroneous strike. And for that, we at the Department are deeply sorry. Just as I committed to Dr. Kwan, I commit to each of you that the Department will ensure a thorough investigation and accounting for the August 29th airstrike, how we can more stringently prevent civilian harm in the future, and how we can support the family of those lost via a condolence payment. Our military mission in Afghanistan may have ended on August 31st, but our service members, diplomats, and government employees remain hard at work. The U.S. government continues to facilitate the departure of U.S. citizens and lawful permanent residents, as well as Afghans who worked for and with us from Afghanistan. From September 1st through October 25th, the U.S. government has directly facilitated the departure of 240 U.S. citizens and 157 lawful permanent residents, as well as others who have come out on private charters. Physically evacuating U.S. citizens, lawful permanent residents, third country nationals, Afghan partners, and other Afghans at risk from Kabul airport was only one step in the extraordinary accomplishment of our military. Across the globe and throughout this country, over 10,000 of our men and women in uniform continue to support the Afghan people alongside our interagency partners via Operation Allies Welcome. We built out military installations across Europe and the Middle East to serve as temporary locations for evacuees as they underwent the necessary vetting and health screenings for them to come to the United States. This portion of the mission was enabled by America's network of allies and partners, a network that no other nation can rival. It demonstrates that our bilateral relationships across the globe continue to be a source of great national strength. At home, we have drawn upon another wellspring of national power, the generosity and hospitality of the American people. We have welcomed over 65,000 Afghan evacuees to 8 safe haven sites located on domestic military installations as they complete the necessary steps to be resettled into the United States. American communities are opening their arms and embracing the evacuees, and with their support, the resilient spirit of the Afghan people is coming to life. For example, at Fort Bliss, Texas, an Afghan interpreter organized and started an informal education program for Afghan children. And at Fort Dix, New Jersey, volunteers organized weddings for Afghan couples who delayed their ceremonies during the fall of Kabul. American service members continue to work around the clock to ensure evacuees are safe and welcome on our installations. Every day, we see our men and women in uniform trading high fives, giving fist bumps, and playing ball with Afghan children. This mission has not been without its challenges, but we are truly proud of all those supporting this historic operation. Despite the end of our military presence in Afghanistan, the work of the department is far from over. We are examining and learning from the past, reckoning with the uncomfortable truth that despite decades and billions of dollars of U.S. investment, the Afghan military evaporated in the face of the Taliban assault. Additionally, we are turning to the future, bolstering our capacity to engage in over-the-horizon counterterrorism operations to ensure that no threat emanating from Afghanistan can harm our homeland or our interests, even as we refocus the department on the challenges posed by China, Russia, and other competitors and adversaries. I know this committee has many questions about the war, the evacuation, and our path forward. I look forward to taking them, but before I do, I'd like to thank the members of this committee for your enduring support and partnership. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to General Mingus.
Good morning. I'd like to start by thanking Chairman Reed, Ranking Member Inhofe, and all members here today for your enduring support of our entire joint force. I would like to extend my appreciation to the SASC for providing me the opportunity to speak with you today about the military's deliberate withdrawal from Afghanistan and the department's contribution to the interagency effort to initially evacuate fully vetted Afghan special immigrant visa holders and execute a non-combatant evacuation operation for U.S. citizens and other Afghans. Our interagency coordination and partnership were and continue to be critical to the ongoing evacuation, processing, and resettlement of evacuees. I could not be more proud of our soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, and civilians whose service and sacrifice throughout the Afghanistan campaign is humbling. It has been the honor of a lifetime to serve alongside them. As Dr. Call just explained, the breadth and depth of the simultaneous evacuation operation was unparalleled. NEO operations are among the most challenging missions a military can undertake. By their very nature, they occur with little notice and are often within tenuous security environments. The department recognized that a NEO could be the most dangerous course of action, and with the interagency, we planned for this contingency. This pre-planning allowed the department to respond quickly to the Department of State's NEO declaration, deploying a force package of nearly 6,000 personnel to HKIA within days. This NEO element executed the largest humanitarian airlift operation ever undertaken. I'm not sure that there is another event that better demonstrates what it means to be an American service member, the willingness to sacrifice self while demonstrating compassion under fire so that others may enjoy the freedom and opportunities we would die to defend. Unfortunately, 13 service members did pay the ultimate price, and they will be regarded as heroes forever. Americans were not the only heroes lost over the course of a 20-year campaign. NATO allies and partners, and especially Afghan civilians, were part of our efforts beginning with the initial invasion. Countless Afghans lost their lives trying to help the United States navigate Afghanistan's difficult human and physical terrain, and countless more Afghan national defense and security forces were lost serving alongside U.S. service members. Unfortunately, we lost 10 more Afghan civilians leading up to our departure during a precision strike we employed to target ISIS-K. As Dr. Call explained, we are committed to the ongoing investigation and to supporting the family members of those lost. We also understand how this strike may cause the committee to question the over-the-horizon counterterrorism operation now that we no longer have a physical footprint in Afghanistan. I look forward to discussing these issues with you today. Furthermore, the ANDCF will be a case study the department will pore over in the ensuing years. We will analyze their development and their ultimate dissolution to determine how to chart better paths for our partners in the future. While we cannot and we will never be able to instill the will to fight, we can and will take the opportunity to better understand those intangible factors that so significantly affect our mission and our nation's interests. Our work did not end on 31 August. The interagency effort to quickly house, transport, vaccinate, and resettle the resultant evacuee population continues to be a Herculean effort, one that would have been extraordinarily more difficult without our allies, partners, and NGOs. We are also continuing to support the interagency as they work to relocate U.S. citizens, lawful permanent residents, and Afghans to whom we hold special commitments, including SIV holders who remain in Afghanistan and have expressed a desire to leave. Despite the Afghan withdrawal and evacuation, the department remains focused on counterterrorism threats to the homeland. While we reprioritize following the withdrawal in the short term, we are actively setting the conditions to ensure we remain situationally aware in our posture to mitigate and neutralize developing terrorist threats and streams. Dr. Call and I look forward to answering your questions today as we work together for the benefit of our country. Thank you again for your time and your support.
Thank you very much, General, and thank you, Ms. Secretary. For both the Secretary and General Mingus, when General Milley was here, he testified that although Al-Qaeda and other terrorist groups had been significantly degraded in the past 20 years, that there may be a resurgence of international terrorism emanating from the region within 12 to 36 months. Do you concur with that assessment, Dr. Call?
I think the assessment depends on which group we're talking about. I think the intelligence community currently assesses that both ISIS-K and Al-Qaeda have the intent to conduct external operations, including against the United States, but neither currently has the capability to do so. We could see ISIS-K generate that capability in somewhere between 6 or 12 months. I think the current assessments by the intelligence community is that Al-Qaeda would take a year or two to reconstitute that capability. And as you said in your opening, Senator, we have to remain vigilant against that possibility.
Thank you. Do you concur, General Mingus?
I do, sir. And I know that it was further refined last week when the Intel folks were here to refine that assessment. So the chairman's assessment, I concur with that.
Thank you. General Mingus, when General McKenzie was here, he indicated, given the departure of physical departure of American personnel from Afghanistan, that our over-the-horizon situation will not give us the same picture that we've got now. The ranges will be greater, the resources will be greater, the risks will all be greater. Do you all assess at this time that despite these increased risks that we're appropriately postured to disrupt terrorist activities emanating from the region?
I'm sorry, sir, the last half of the question?
Despite these increased risks, which we all recognize, do you believe we're appropriately postured at this time to disrupt terrorist threats emanating from the region and are adapting so we can consistently disrupt these activities?
Sir, as you know, and the chairman and the secretary both briefed, and so did General McKenzie, the over-the-horizon counterterrorism capability that we have in place right now. And we will go, Dr. Call and I will go into much more detail during the closed session, but as you know, we have a command and control architecture set up in the Gulf. We're able to project assets from the Gulf. We're able to collect across all the sources of intelligence, fuse that, and continue to analyze, and if necessary, take action in Afghanistan. As General McKenzie and the chairman both indicated, it is harder, but we believe we have the assets in place right now, if necessary, to disrupt and or degrade the terrorist networks in Afghanistan.
Thank you. Secretary Call, some of us have suggested that the administration should have started evacuating people from Afghanistan sooner. Was it the administration's assessment that doing so would have hastened the fall of Kabul by suggesting that the United States did not have confidence in the Ghani government? And did we, in fact, give assurances to President Ghani that we would maintain a presence and not signal our lack of confidence?
So, Senator, the goal during the retrograde was to assist the Afghan government, not undermine them. And there was concern that if you accelerated evacuations to include of large numbers of Afghans, that it would create a self-fulfilling prophecy of accelerating the collapse of the Afghan government. That is also something that President Ghani raised as a chief concern. We did bring out more than 1,000 SIVs prior to the NEO. But there was a concern that a mass exodus could undermine the government.
Thank you. Finally, Dr. Kaul, can you give us updates with respect to our arrangements with Pakistan regarding their cooperation with us in counterterrorism? There have been press reports recently that they are working with the Taliban to attack ISIS-K, which is an enemy of both. But can you give us any further assessment?
So Pakistan is a challenging actor, but they don't want Afghanistan to be a safe haven for terrorist attacks, external attacks, not just against Pakistan, but against others. They continue to give us access to Pakistani airspace, and we're in conversations about keeping that airspace open, and happy to talk about that more in the closed session. But for right now, the counterterrorism cooperation with Pakistan is pretty good. Thank
you very much. Senator Inhofe, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. One of the many confusing things about this whole thing is that we really don't know how many Americans were left in Afghanistan. The administration's number of U.S. citizens left in Afghanistan keeps changing. We all understand that, and it's very confusing. The administration always said 100 to 200 U.S. citizens left in Afghanistan, but it has already withdrawn 234 and is in contact with 363 others, 176 of whom want to leave. Now, I'm speaking slowly because I'm trying to put this together at the same time. The administration, by its own count, left 600 Americans behind, over 400 of whom want to leave, not the 100 to 200 that has been referred to several times. There are still thousands of Americans unaccounted for, based on Secretary Blinken's earlier claim that there were 10 to 15,000. Mid-August, Secretary of State Blinken tells senators, we were all there, that 10,000 to 15,000 Americans were in Afghanistan. On the 31st of August, the administration claims it withdrew 6,000. And do the math as we're saying this. It withdrew 6,000 Americans from Afghanistan. Now, this would mean somewhere between 4,000 and 9,000 Americans were left behind. But the administration says 100 to 200 are remaining. In October, the administration stated that 234 Americans have been evacuated since the 31st of August. The State Department says in contact that says it's in contact with 363 more Americans in Afghanistan, 176 of whom want to leave. Now, if we can figure this out, you're doing a lot better than I have done, and I've made a real effort to go down and document everything that is in there. So at the very least, it's confusing. During the August 18th interview on ABC, George Stephanopoulos asked President Biden whether U.S. troops would stay beyond August the 31st if there were still Americans to evacuate. President Biden responded, quote, and this is a quote, "If there are American citizens left, we are going to stay to get them out." Of course, this didn't happen. So, Secretary Call, I would ask you the question, when did you realize that the United States would not be able to get all of the U.S. citizens out of Afghanistan by August the 31st? And did you present your leadership any options for extending that self-imposed deadline to ensure that our people were out of harm's way at that time?
Well, as a first matter, nobody was abandoned. We continue to get people out of Afghanistan, including American citizens. And Senator, if you'd like, I'm happy to go through the latest numbers on that. But to your
well, now, yeah, I would ask you to pause there. The latest numbers, I've already done the latest numbers, and maybe there are later numbers than I just read earlier. Are there
so
later numbers?
I can give you some fidelity on the numbers.
I agree with that.
Okay, all right. So the validated numbers from the State Department during the NEO were 6,000 Americans. We estimate we evacuated about 5,500. Since the end of the NEO, so since September 1st, the State Department documented 240 American citizens who have departed Afghanistan since September 1st and 157 green card holders. When you account for additional individuals who were not arranged for travel outside of Afghanistan by the U.S. government but came out through other private charters, DOD's numbers total out to 314 AMSITs total and 266 LPR total since the end of the NEO. In terms of how many American citizens we estimate are currently in Afghanistan, the Department of State is in contact with 196 American citizens who are ready to depart, and arrangements are being made for them to do so either via air or over ground. And another 243 American citizens have been contacted and are not ready to depart, either because they want to stay in Afghanistan or aren't ready. Those are the current numbers.
Question that I asked, did you present your leadership any options for extending that self-imposed deadline to ensure that our people were out of harm's way? Did you do it?
Yeah,
and if it wasn't you,
it was
who
the
would it be?
consensus. So it was the consensus of civilian and military leadership of the Department of Defense that we should stick to the August 31st deadline, that extending beyond that would cause a risk to mission and force and would make it harder to get American citizens out beyond that date.
The same military leadership that insisted that we leave troops down there at the time that we evacuated.
That is correct.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Senator Inhofe. Senator Shaheen, please.
Thank you both for being here this morning and for your efforts to support the evacuation in Afghanistan. I want to start by recognizing, as both of you did, the tremendous service of our men and women in the military who made possible that evacuation and continue to support Afghan refugees. I was proud that 11 members of the New Hampshire National Guard volunteered to go to Joint Base McGuire as part of Operation Allies Refuge, and believe that they represent what we've seen across our armed forces. We have also heard in our office from a number of those men and women who served in Afghanistan who continue to be concerned about people they served with, Afghans they served with during their time there, who are still in Afghanistan, whose lives are being threatened by the Taliban because of their service with the United States. And so, General Mingus, you referenced those SIV applicants. I wonder if you can tell me what we continue to do to try and ensure that those SIV applicants and those who have received special immigrant visas already are going to be evacuated out of Afghanistan or either to the United States or somewhere else where they will be safe.
Thank you, Senator. As you know, the State Department has a group that they've established underneath Ambassador Jones, and underneath that, there's a group that solely focuses on the additional folks coming out of Afghanistan. They are also working with about 52 special interest groups that Dr. Call's office and the Joint Staff are a part of. We meet with those groups twice a week because they have knowledge and understanding and contact with other Afghans at risk that continue to try and come out. And as the State Department works the documentation, there is generally a flight or two a week that does bring out not just American citizens and legal permanent residents, but also Afghans at risk.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but do you have a sense of how many SIV applicants remain in Afghanistan? Or Secretary Call, do you know that number?
So the total number of SIVs in the pipeline is 28,000, according to our records, of which 8,555 have come out with their family members. So that would suggest there's a significant number of SIVs still in Afghanistan. And Senator, I share your concern, and we will work to try to get them out and hold the Taliban to their pledge for safe passage with people with documents, which should include SIVs.
As I'm sure you're both aware, one of the challenges for those SIV applicants has been getting the documents that can confirm that they actually worked alongside our military. And one of the challenges has been that DOD has not provided documents in many cases. And so what are we doing to reform that issue for not just for the current SIV applicants, but for future?
So as this committee is aware, the SIV process was not designed for an emergency. It's very slow. Typically, it took a year or two. Nothing was done in the previous administration to speed that up. Nothing was done to bring anybody out from Afghanistan after the Doha Agreement in 2020. At the beginning of the Biden administration, the State Department took some steps that shrunk the time to about 8 months. That's still way too long. The Department of Defense created an enormous database and has refined that data over time to try to speed up the confirmation of employment. The DOD itself doesn't provide the documents, the visas. That obviously comes through the State Department. In some cases, they have provided physical visas to people who are in Afghanistan. In other cases, there are electronic documents that have been transmitted because obviously our embassy is not in Afghanistan anymore.
Well, Senator Ernst and I worked on legislation that has passed the Congress to try and speed up that process. But if there are other changes that need to be made, I hope you will share that with the committee so that we can continue to try and ensure that we don't have bureaucratic impediments to getting people out of the country. My other question, because my time is short, has to do with the status of ISIS-K in Afghanistan. And we've seen an increase in the number of attacks in Afghanistan. Is it our assessment that the Taliban has the capacity to defeat ISIS-K in the country?
I think it is our assessment that the Taliban and ISIS-K are mortal enemies. So the Taliban is highly motivated to go after ISIS-K. Their ability to do so, I think, is to be determined.
Do you share that, General Mingus?
I do, ma'am.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Sheen. Senator Wicker, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I, first of all, have a statement. The Undersecretary, in his prepared remarks on page 3, talks about the work of the department is far from over. We're examining and learning from the past, reckoning with the uncomfortable truth that despite decades and billions of dollars of U.S. investment, the Afghan military evaporated in the face of the Taliban assault. Let me just remind everyone that for the past 6 or 7 years before the debacle in Kabul, the Afghan military took almost all of the casualties and fatalities and fought bravely on behalf of their country. And General Mingus, I appreciate the fact that you've been deployed a number of times and have served in dangerous situations. But on the final page of your written statement, you talk about the ANDSF, Afghan National Defense Security Forces. You say there'll be a case study for the department in ensuing years. Indeed, there'll be a case study for historians in the coming years. And you make this statement, while we cannot and will never be able to instill the will to fight, we can and will take the opportunity to better understand and so forth. May I suggest that both of those statements are unworthy of the Secretary of Defense for Policy of this administration or of the Director of Operations for the Joint Staff. And in fact, it was a decision by this administration to pull support for the Afghan National Defense Forces that led to the debacle, and to suggest that this group of armed forces supported by the United States, but populated almost entirely by Afghan soldiers, was unwilling to fight or evaporated in the face of combat is a shameful and unworthy statement. Now, Mr. Secretary, on August 10th, the White House said that President Biden believed that it's not inevitable that the Taliban takes over Kabul or the country, and I'm quoting directly. 5 days later, we abandoned the embassy in Kabul. Do you think this sent a signal to the Afghan National Defense Forces that we were out of there and that they could not depend on us anymore? And was that part of was the abandonment of the embassy part of the troop withdrawal plans?
It was not part of the plan. The embassy was evacuated once the ANDSF had essentially already collapsed. So starting on or about August 11th, you saw a cascade of provincial capitals that culminated in the Taliban entering Kabul. The ANDSF evaporated. President Ghani left the country on the 15th, and we moved our diplomats to the airport.
General Mingus, who took the vast majority of the casualties in combat from, say, 2014 to the abandonment of Kabul?
Is the Afghan National Security Forces.
Okay. Do you think it is fair to suggest that they did not have the will to fight? We cannot, never will be able to instill the will to fight. Is that a fair statement, General?
Sir, I agree how the chairman and the secretary qualified when we talked about this very topic during their testimony. The leadership and the will to fight, when we pulled off at the tactical level from an advisory perspective several years ago, our visibility in terms of the condition of the Afghan National Security Forces became less and less. What I would offer, based on my experiences, is that I have fought alongside the Afghans, and there is no issue with their will to fight. I think the follow-on thing that we will need to study as part of history is the will to fight for what? And that, I think, is the fundamental question, i.e., did they have the will to fight in Afghanistan against other Afghans? And that's the part I think that we will have to determine going forward.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Senator Wicker. Now, Senator Hildebrand. Excuse me, Senator Hirono.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Cald, did I hear you say that Al-Qaeda and ISIS-K are developing the capability to attack the U.S. within 2 years?
What I said was that the current intelligence community's assessment is that ISIS-K could potentially develop a capability within 6 to 12 months, and that Al-Qaeda could potentially develop that capability within 1 to 2 years. But it's precisely that threat that we need to remain vigilant against and disrupt.
How do we determine whether they have the intention or the will to attack once they have the capability to do so?
Well, I think we are actually fairly certain that they have the intention to do so. And I think the committee had the opportunity to hear from the intelligence community in a classified setting not too long ago, and we can follow up in the closed session. But we have considerable evidence that they have the intent. The question at the moment is the capability.
Well, you just said that they will have the capability within 2 years.
They could have the capability within 2 years. Yep.
So since they have the intent, and then they will develop the capability. And so I don't know whether it's in the closed session that you will tell us what we're doing to defend against the combination of both the capability and the will to attack. I have an ongoing concern shared by others on this committee about how the Taliban are treating women and girls in Afghanistan, given their brutal history. It's not likely that this will improve. This is for you, Secretary Call. What is your understanding of the conditions on the ground for women and girls in Afghanistan under Taliban rule following our withdrawal? And what is your assessment of our ability, along with the international community, to effectively provide and direct aid directly to these vulnerable groups under Taliban control? I have a series of questions, so I'll just put them to you. Are there any ongoing operations to assist prominent female Afghan leaders who are at risk from retribution from the Taliban? And back in May, I joined my colleagues, Senators Shaheen and Collins, in asking President Biden to appoint an ambassador at large for global women's issues to coordinate the protection of women and girls' rights in Afghanistan. I think that position is needed now more than ever. To your knowledge, has anyone been nominated to fill this spot? Could you respond to my series of questions?
I'm happy to. So as it relates to the situation on the ground in Afghanistan, I think we all have to be a little humble that the reports are largely anecdotal, not systematic. But the conditions are not good. The Taliban are a ruthless authoritarian band. They promised to put forward an inclusive government. They did not do that. Reports suggest that women and girls are having a hard time going to school. We have not seen evidence yet of widespread reprisals, but that doesn't mean it's not happening. It just means we haven't seen that evidence yet. But there clearly are violence levels and human rights abuses to include against women and girls. I think that the international community has some leverage points with the new Taliban government. Taliban government wants recognition. They should not get that recognition unless they are a very different government than the one that they are now. They have profound economic needs. That provides some leverage, and we should continue to provide humanitarian assistance, not to the government, but around the government, to at-risk populations. As it relates to the State Department's position on women and girls, I don't have any information on that, and I would ask that I would defer that to the State Department.
I know that the international community has come forward with literally billions of dollars in aid that's supposed to go directly to non-governmental entities, but my understanding is that they have to work with the Taliban in order to make sure that the aid gets to the people that they are providing the aid to. So how much of the aid that the international community, including the United States, is providing will actually get to these organizations and out of Taliban's hands? Do you have some sense of that?
So obviously that falls more in the writ of the USAID, and I would defer on specifics to them. But my understanding from my USAID colleagues is that, and from our US-UN colleagues, is that NGOs and international organizations are able to operate around the Taliban government to provide aid directly, but it's harder.
We know that there are still a number of people who are seeking SIV status. So what agency is leading that effort to enable the documentation, et cetera, necessary for these applicants to get that status and then to leave Afghanistan?
So the State Department is in the lead for the SIV issue, but to the degree that they need assistance from the Department of Defense to verify employment, we've set up a project called Project Rabbit to streamline the data and make sure that we can make that process as efficient as possible.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Hirono. Senator Fisher, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Last month, Generals Milley and McKenzie both testified on the challenges of conducting over-the-horizon counterterrorism strikes against targets in Afghanistan. Unlike other places in the world where we conduct over-the-horizon CT operations, Afghanistan is landlocked. We have no reliable partners on the ground, and we don't have any basing agreements with neighboring countries. Secretary Call, in the months since Secretary Austin, General Milley, and General McKenzie testified, have we secured any basing agreements or arrangements with any country bordering Afghanistan?
We have not secured firm basing arrangements. We have had extensive conversations, which I'd be happy to discuss
Also,
in the closed
Secretary
session.
Call, since President Biden made the decision to withdraw in April, He has touted over the Horizon CT operations as our strategy going forward. Can you share with the committee any tangible steps the administration has made in trying to secure basing agreements with those countries? And keep it short, please. I have a number of questions.
Sure. We have arrangements already in the Gulf, as you know. We're in conversations with Pakistan to keep the air line of communication open. We've also had conversations with Uzbekistan and Tajikistan, which we can talk about in the closed session.
Okay, thank you. I look forward to learning about the status of all those negotiations with those countries. General Mingus, with the Taliban in control of the Afghan government and absence of reliable on-the-ground partners, is it more challenging or less challenging to collect intelligence on ISIS-K and al-Qaeda in Afghanistan? And that's particularly looking at the intelligence that's needed to identify and also to locate targets for counterterrorism operations.
Yes, ma'am, that is a fair characterization. It is more challenging to collect. And in the closed session, we'll lay out some of the percentages for you across all the different intel specialties in terms of what that degradation looks like.
Thank you. Secretary Call, prior to August, were you aware of reports of extremely low morale among Afghan forces or of reports that they had not been paid in months?
Broadly aware, but I think our visibility onto the exact conditions was highly degraded.
Were you concerned in June when the Taliban took control of 21 districts across 9 provinces over the course of 4 days, most of them without a single shot being fired?
Yes.
At this point or any other point prior to August 14th, did you ever question the intelligence community's assessment that the Afghan government and Afghan security forces would remain viable for weeks to months, even years following our departure? That's a quote.
I repeatedly engaged my intelligence colleagues, and as you know, Senator, the estimate shifted from 1 to 2 years to months to years, and then weeks to months, and then days to weeks.
I think this disconnect between the reality on the ground and what the Biden administration assessed would happen with respect to the collapse of the Afghan security forces is deeply troubling. It was not just that our predictions were overtaken by events. Some of the underlying assumptions upon which the analysis were based were very flawed. Mr. Secretary, how can you possibly assure us that such a disconnect is not happening between the reality on the ground and the Biden administration's analysis of how long it's going to take al-Qaeda or ISIS-K to gain ability to attack the United States? And when you speak of 6 months as a possibility when our homeland would be in extreme danger, those were numbers that were given to us several months ago. Will we hear an update on that in the classified?
So on the latter, we will give you the update. I think there was also a number of our intel colleagues over here a few days ago that provided you with the latest. I think we should all be humble that we've all known less about Afghanistan than we thought we did. I think that especially after the Doha agreement in 2020, our forces declined substantially, and we pulled off the Afghan security forces, so we had less feel for what was going on.
So,
and
Secretary,
that got worse in 2021.
Mr. Secretary, would you agree with General McKenzie's testimony then that, quote, the war on terror is not over and the war in Afghanistan is not over either?
There are terrorist threats all over the globe. In fact, the biggest ones, as you're aware,
Specifically
currently
to
emanate from Somalia,
Afghanistan is
Yemen,
my,
Syria.
Mr. Secretary, specifically to my question, it's on Afghanistan. That war is not over either?
I think the war as we know it isn't continuing, but the terrorist threat continues.
And do you agree with General Milley's testimony that the outcome of this war was a strategic failure?
I think the strategic objective of decimating al-Qaeda and getting bin Laden was achieved. I think the broader nation-building mission that several administrations had was not successful.
Do you believe that the Biden administration bears any responsibility for the outcome of this war or for the Taliban now being in charge of Afghanistan?
I think what we saw unfold in the past few months would have happened whenever we left Afghanistan.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Fisher. Senator King, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I feel like we're in a time warp where history started on January 20th of 2021, when in fact history in this case started on February 29th of 2020, when the Doha Agreement was signed. I've read it, I don't know, probably 10 times. I'm a country lawyer, but it's not conditions-based. It guarantees that we will withdraw from Afghanistan in a certain number of months and a certain number of days. It even sets the day. It does talk about that the Taliban guarantees that al-Qaeda won't have safe haven. As far as we know, that's still the case. It does talk about negotiations between the Taliban and the Afghan government, but that does not appear to be a condition of our withdrawal. The decision to leave Afghanistan was made by the former administration in February of 2020. The question before the President Biden was, do you abide by that agreement or do you abrogate it? And we're talking now about the consequences of abiding by it. But let's talk for a minute about the consequences of abrogating it. General Mingus, what would have happened had the President said in April of 2021, we've decided not to withdraw our troops from Afghanistan, but to maintain our presence there? What would have been the result of that decision?
It is my belief that attacks from the Taliban, the one condition in the Doha Agreement that they did generally adhere to, would have resumed.
And in order to respond to those attacks, it would have been necessary to augment our presence, would it not?
Potentially, although the assessment by General McKenzie and General Miller at the time was that 2,500 was sufficient to be able to deal with that, but time would have only been able to tell based on the veracity and the type of attacks that would have started to occur.
So, and then to get to August 31st, I remember the discussions, I remember the phone calls, the conference calls around that time. Was it not the unanimous recommendation of the military that staying beyond August 31st, which would have violated the agreement with the Taliban, would have subjected our troops and the citizens who remained to greater danger than leaving and working with the Taliban to extract the remaining citizens, which in fact has happened? Wasn't that the consensus, that the danger to the troops, both from the Taliban, who would have been free to attack us at that point because of the abrogation of the August 31st agreement, but also the terrorist threat, which we saw play itself out at the airport?
That is correct, Senator. The consensus amongst the Joint Chiefs, the commanders on the ground, that staying past 31 August, attacks would have resumed, and the ability to get additional American citizens and legal permanent residents out would have actually, the risk to that would have gone up higher than had we departed as we did.
And in fact, since August 31st, the Taliban has honored, I don't know if it's an agreement or it's an understanding or a implicit understanding, that they've let these Americans out, and in fact, they've been letting SIVs out. Is that correct?
That is correct, Senator. It has not been without challenge, but they continue, those that are properly documented, they've continued to let them depart. And the numbers, as Dr. Call briefed earlier.
Mr. Carl, what's your assessment of if the President had made the opposite decision, which the military, admittedly, we've established through testimony, recommended an additional 2,500. Would 2,500 have been enough had the Taliban resumed attacks on Americans in the country over the course of 2021?
I think there are two points that weighed heavily on the President. One was the issue that in the exchange you just had with General Mingus, which was if we had stayed beyond, would we have come under attack, and therefore would the President have faced pressure to send in reinforcements for force protection? But the other issue, which gets less attention, but I know the President considered, was that the assessment by the intelligence community was that us staying at 2,500 was not producing a stalemate. It was an eroding stalemate. In other words, the Afghans were losing. And so at some point, even if we weren't taking casualties, the President would have faced pressure to escalate, just like Barack Obama did at the beginning of his administration when the Afghans were losing, and just like President Trump did at the beginning of his administration when the Afghans were losing. So the President did not believe that 2,500 troops was a stable equilibrium. If we had kept at that level, he would have been under pressure to put in more.
Thank you, and I appreciate this. I think I like Senator Duckworth's proposal that we have a nonpartisan commission to examine this, to really get to the bottom of it. I would point out that I think this is our 6th hearing on Afghanistan in the last several months. I've had 3 or 4 in the Intelligence Committee. We had 0 hearings that I can recall on the Doha Agreement, which was really the heart of the departure from Afghanistan. So the umbrage and outrage about what's happened since this summer rings a little hollow for me, because there was no umbrage or outrage when the former administration essentially made an agreement with the Taliban, unconditional, essentially, really unconditional, to get our troops out by a certain date, which, by the way, was May 1st of 2021, not August 31st. So with that, Mr. President, I yield. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator King. Senator Ernst, please.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair and gentlemen. Thank you for being here today as we continue to examine the repercussions of President Biden's disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan and the abandonment of Americans to the hands of the Taliban. Mr. Call, Dr. Call, is it true that President Biden said we wouldn't leave when there were Americans left behind?
We have not left Americans behind. They continue to get out.
We left Americans behind.
We did not leave Americans behind. They continue to get out.
Did the
Military mission
DOD,
ended
you
on
represent the
August
DOD,
31st.
Dr. Call, did the DOD leave before all Americans were out?
It was the consensus judgment that leaving on August 31st was the best way to continue.
So the
to get Americans
DOD,
out.
General Mingus, did our soldiers leave before all Americans were out?
Yes, ma'am. The last airplane left the evening of the 30th, morning of the 31st of August.
Thank you for your straightforward answer, General Mingus. Dr. Call, is there more or less risk of terror attacks against Americans and American interests because of the precipitous withdrawal of American military capability from the region?
I think the intelligence community assesses that the overall risk to the homeland across the world is at its lowest point since 9/11. We've already discussed the possibility that ISIS-K and al-Qaeda could reconstitute, and we have to be vigilant against that in Afghanistan.
That does not sound like a low risk when you have just told us that the possibility of attack from ISIS-K to our homeland could be 6 to 12 months from now.
The intelligence community assesses they could build that capability. We need to be vigilant in disrupting that.
So it doesn't sound like low risk. So, Dr. Call, what threat assessments did you use for planning the security environment that would occur after the U.S. withdrawal? What assessments?
Well, when I came into office, the decision had already been made, and I was overseeing, from a civilian perspective, the retrograde operations.
Yes, I understand. You informed me the last time in a closed session that you were busy sitting on the couch, so you weren't paying attention to those assessments, which I disagreed with, because I do believe that in a position such as yours, you should absolutely be keeping up with various assessments, especially as we're pulling out our military troops, leaving Americans and SIV holders behind. So since you came into office, those assessments that were used by others, did they prove to be accurate?
I think the consensus, as we discussed a couple of minutes ago, the assessments constantly change. So originally, the intelligence community assessed 1 to 2 years after the withdrawal of U.S. forces would be the point where the ANDSF might collapse. It then became closer to a year, and then months to years, and then weeks to months, and then days to weeks in August. And I was paying attention to all of those assessments once I was in the position.
Thank you. And that would mean that any policy recommendations and planning recommendations that were made at that time are now ill-fitted for the security environment that we're now facing.
We were posturing to an over-the-horizon posture even before the ANDSF collapsed. Obviously, the ANDSF collapse makes that mission harder, but hard is not impossible.
What regional force postures, and this is going back to a number of questions you've already had, what other regional force postures, capabilities, ISR, are we now recommending be readied to deal with the security environment that is now true on the ground?
So we have a robust presence in the Gulf. Beyond that, we should really talk about this in the closed session.
And just in the time remaining as well, what measures have you recommended to address the reconstitution that we're now learning about with ISIS-K and al-Qaeda?
Well, I think we need to remain vigilant against that threat and collecting intelligence, and we can talk about exactly how we're doing that in the closed session. But we also need to build out more capability, so it's not just reliant on the facilities we have in the Arabian Gulf.
And just in the remaining time I have, thank you, gentlemen, again for being here today. We are going to continue looking into this. I do hope we are able to form an outside committee that can take a look at the past 20 years of the war on terror. But I also want to express my heartfelt gratitude to the men and women that have served our great United States Armed Forces and all that they have given and their families have given over the course of the past 20 years. They have faced significant and sometimes insurmountable challenges, and yet they have overcome and they have served us well. And we can never diminish their service, especially in the face of an administration that would not listen to our military leaders. So God bless them and their service to our great United States. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Senator Gillibrand, please. Thank you, Senator.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I, too, want to commend the service of all of our service members who have served in Afghanistan and the intelligence officers and Afghan personnel who supported them. I want to focus on the last point that Senator Ernst made about a review. Dr. Call and General Mingus, members of the committee, myself included, have proposed a comprehensive, rigorous, and objective audit on the war in its entirety. As last month's hearing, General Milley acknowledged that there have been many lessons to be learned from America's longest war. Secretary Austin further stated any commission or review of the war should be an interagency effort. Do you have any recommendations for an external independent review of the war in Afghanistan? For example, what do you think Congress's role should be? What U.S. agencies, countries, and organizations do you recommend be included?
So we're supportive of Senator Duckworth's proposal for an independent commission on this, strongly supportive of that. We also have efforts underway at the Department of Defense or about to be underway. The Joint Staff has an effort. My organization is working to identify an independent institution that can do an independent review, especially of the time period from February 2020 through the end of the NEO. And we're in conversations with the NSC and the State Department and the intelligence community to make sure whatever we do is aligned with their ongoing lessons learned activities.
General?
Ma'am, I would echo Dr. Call's comments, fully support after 20 years and all the treasure and resources we owe our nation some better answers in terms of what we've learned.
With the testimony that's been given earlier in this hearing of an estimate that ISIS-K could launch an attack within 6 to 12 months, that the Taliban, that al-Qaeda could launch an attack within 1 to 2 years, acknowledging that we are in an unclassified setting, what are some of the broad objectives our adversaries may have within Afghanistan, and what planning is DoD doing in response to those recommendations and objectives?
Yes, so I think the intelligence community would say that that ISIS-K and al-Qaeda could have the capability to do attacks within that time frame. Whether they do or not is, of course, not something that can be predicted with any degree of certainty. We are deploying ISR over Afghanistan every single day. We also have national technical means, which we can talk more about in the classified setting. We are sharing intelligence with regional partners and with our other partners, the UK and others who are very focused on this problem set. So we will get after this challenge, and we will try to grow our capability to get after it. I will say, I do think the Taliban is highly motivated to go after ISIS-K for the reasons we discussed earlier. They're a mortal enemy. I think al-Qaeda is much more complicated because the Taliban, especially the Haqqanis, have a relationship with al-Qaeda. But we have seen signs, and we can talk again more in the classified setting, that the Taliban is wary about Afghanistan being a springboard for al-Qaeda external attacks, not because the Taliban are good guys, but because they fear international retribution if that were to occur.
Ma'am, and if I could, because
Please.
this has come up several times in terms of the timeframes for al-Qaeda and ISIS-K, those estimates from the intel community, that's based on no U.S. or coalition intervention. When applied, and what we'll talk about in the classified session in terms of our strategy and what we're doing, the goal would be to keep those time horizons where they're at now, if not even further.
Can you give an assessment in this setting, what your view is with regard to regional instability and how that may impact both Russia and China?
So I think both Russia and China are nervous, frankly, despite what their propaganda outlets would suggest. Afghanistan is now a problem that's much more on their doorstep than on ours. I think both of them have counterterrorism concerns inside of Afghanistan. I think both Moscow and Beijing are more willing to work with the Taliban than we are. But I think they're concerned. I think Afghanistan's other neighbors, we've already talked about Pakistan, but the Central Asian states, they worry about the counterterrorism challenge. They also worry about the implosion of Afghanistan leading to refugee flows that would spill across their borders.
What resources, trade agreements, military operations, or bilateral relation improvements do you think will be necessary to gain support from regional partners such as Uzbekistan to enable over-the-horizon operations or any other collaborations?
We have some very specific ideas, but on that score, I recommend we talk about that in the closed session. It's very sensitive.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Gillibrand. Senator Tillis, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you. I think you've done an extraordinary job with the oversight on this matter and appreciate your willingness to do that. You know, we've gathered a lot of very important information through these hearings. And Secretary Call, I think it would be helpful. I like the fact that you support an independent commission, but I think it would also be helpful as that ramps up for our committee to compile a bipartisan comprehensive report on what we've all learned through these oversight hearings. So can I get your commitment to work with the minority and majority staff to put such a report together?
You have my commitment to provide you the information you need for that effort.
General Mingus, and when we talk about the 2,500 troop, and Secretary Call, I may come back to you if I have time, but I think that we need to understand more broadly what I believe. I just want to confirm that I have my facts correct. General Miller, Milley, McKenzie have all said that there was a consensus that with 2,500 troops that we could maintain a relatively stable situation. Nothing's guaranteed, but weren't we in fact talking about 2,500 fighters, the intelligence community largely remaining in place in Afghanistan, and another almost 6,000 troops from our NATO partners and allies? So we're talking somewhere on the order of about maybe 8,000, 8,500 being present in Afghanistan. Is that roughly the numbers?
If the NATO coalition contractors, civilians would have stayed consistent, sir, yes, that number is accurate.
And that would have been our ISR assets, our strike capabilities, all the other things that would be inherent with that sort of troop presence.
Those ISR assets, that actually was inside, largely inside the 2,500, but then there was, from a strike perspective, that you had both assets in Afghanistan and from the Gulf.
And by the way, Senator King, I have been against the Doha Agreement since February the 29th. I thought it was a bad idea. It was fundamentally flawed, and I'm not surprised where we are today. But I do have to question, it seems to me, based on briefings that we've received, that there were a number of examples since the signing of the agreement where the Taliban is either did not live up to the letter or the spirit of the agreement. I think one thing that we heard consistently is that they were doing targeted attacks of Afghan national leadership, which was one of the destabilizing influences with respect to the eroding confidence in the Afghan national forces. General Mingus, you said that they have generally honored the agreement, or it may have been Secretary Call, but I can tell you in two real-life examples where they haven't in terms of allowing people to leave. They slit the throat of a pregnant woman, excuse me, that we were working on to get out who had, she was in, I think, the P1 category. They also slit the throat. We have pictures that family members ultimately sent to us, 2 of the 900 people that we have on a list that we're still trying to get people out of the country. So the Taliban may be doing a better job in the marketing department, but we know every single day people are dying there that have a legitimate reason to be out of the country. So with respect to the broader agreement, though, can you give me other examples? You said they've generally adhered to the terms of the Doha Agreement. Can you give me a couple of examples where that's not the case?
I apologize if I misspoke. I meant they had only complied with one of the many, and that was largely not attacking U.S. forces since the Doha Agreement.
Okay. So
all the others, they were in clear violation.
I'm glad to hear that because that's consistent with what General Milley testified to a couple of weeks ago. And so we can't say that the agreement did not have terms or did not have conditions, and they broke that. So now, Secretary Call, I want to go back to you. You testified before that some of the decisions or the recommendations of the remaining 2,500 troops predated your confirmation, but after you were confirmed, were you briefed on that? And to what extent did these discussions, or to what extent did these proposals even get considered when we saw the eroding process occurring in Afghanistan, or was it pretty much covered ground at that point, not considered by the time you got in at the end of April?
So by the time I got in, the decision had been made by the president, and the department was executing on that decision. There was not a major relitigation of kind of reversing course. I think as you heard from General Miller in closed briefing to you, in his view, once we did the retrograde, because we were already so small, so compact, speed was safety. So we really had the bulk of the retrograde done by the beginning of July. The remaining mission was to protect the embassy, which is why we concentrated at the embassy compound and then a few hundred troops at HKIA. We did put in a couple hundred additional troops to assist with close air support in the July-August timeframe as the Taliban was making gains. But that was essentially a short-term measure. This plan was still to stick to the August 31st date, and that was not relitigated to the best of my knowledge.
Thank you. And Secretary Call, I look forward to our committee being able to compile a report based on what we've learned through these oversight hearings. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator Tillis. Senator Warren, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The U.S. went into Afghanistan almost exactly 20 years ago now. It took us only about 2 months to dislodge the Taliban from power and another 3 months to root out al-Qaeda from the mountains east of Kabul. But then we just stayed. We started nation building and attempted to create an Afghan national army. We were used by warlords and by other government officials to target their enemies, not our enemies. We had little understanding of the underlying political dynamics. We went into places like Pesh and the Korangal valleys in search of Osama bin Laden and al-Qaeda and created new enemies instead. Wesley Morgan's The Hardest Place details how those areas were actually not fertile ground for the Taliban before our arrival, but that with each civilian we accidentally killed, and we killed many, we drove their friends and their families into the arms of the Taliban. The opium fields created another dilemma. We would bomb or otherwise destroy the opium crops and drive those farmers into the arms of the Taliban, or we would allow the opium to grow and watch the Taliban shake down the farmers and use the proceeds to finance their operations, or we would give the farmers fertilizer to grow something else and then watch the farmers sell the fertilizer to the makers of IEDs. On top of all that, we flooded the country with billions of dollars, fueling the epidemic corruption that was undermining the very legitimacy of the Afghan government that we were trying to prop up. So, Dr. Call, what do you believe has been the impact of U.S. actions in Afghanistan on the conditions that allowed the Taliban and al-Qaeda to regroup and gain strength?
So I think, Senator, the stories and examples that you just used, I think, strongly suggest that we've never known as much about Afghanistan as we thought we did. I think the Secretary testified that we didn't have a 20-year strategy in Afghanistan. We had 21-year plans. All the zigzagging, the examples on the counter-narcotics front that you provided are illustrative of that. I think that we made some progress in Afghanistan. I think living conditions for many were improved. I think access to schooling for women and girls was improved. I think things got better. But a lot of the deep structural challenges that Afghanistan had, its tribal structure, its endemic corruption, the fact that it's never had a long history of a strong central government that could impose its will on the hinterlands of the country, we were not able to overcome any of that. And the Taliban were fearsome fighters who were going to fight for forever. So I think those are realities that we were not able to overcome.
You know, and I only want to push back on one point. I understand that we can point to women made progress in the country, and they may be losing a part of that. But I think it's hard to describe overall that things got better in Afghanistan. Who was caught in the middle of all of this violence? Who watched various government officials enrich themselves through corruption? Who suffered the most? Innocent Afghan civilians. The Cost of War Project at Brown University estimates that approximately 47,000 Afghan civilians were killed, along with another 66,000 Afghan military and police. And while all of this was happening, while we were creating the very conditions that were used to justify our continued presence, military officials came before this committee one after another, time after time, and said, we're making progress. We're turning the corner. General Milley told this committee last month that our presence would have been needed indefinitely. Dr. Call, do you agree with that assessment?
Yes.
And what would that have meant for the Taliban and al-Qaeda?
It would have meant that we would have had thousands of people, probably more than 2,500 over time as the ANDSF continued to lose, or we took casualties. That was at least the president's assessment. We would have been spending tens of billions of dollars every year, and also sacrificing our service members, and our participation in the war and the cost that you described would have continued.
And I would argue that if our presence would have been required indefinitely, that casts grave doubt on the years of military assessments that we were ever making progress here. This whole enterprise was a catch-22, and it should humble everyone in this room. It should cause all of us to reflect on how badly everyone got it wrong. And above all, it should be a call for Congress and this committee in particular to start exercising more oversight of the Pentagon during ongoing military operations, and instead of waiting until it's over and then politically advantageous to do so. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.